I am using my points of reviewing each book as my own opinion for the purpose of commentary. In addition, this is intended for educational and informational purposes, and I do not claim ownership over the original work. Thank you. Hello, thank you for tuning in. We are on letter 13, the letters of Marsilio Ficino. It's titled Favorable Auspice for Philosophy from Mercury, Saturn, and the Sun. The letter is to Niccolo Valori, and Ficino says, no one is more favorable in the study of philosophy than this man Ficino's writing to. So Ficino, from reading his letters, you kind of have different forms of writing. You can write like a diary, keeping it to yourself, versus a letter directed towards someone. And Ficino very integrated many different people he's talking to. It would be interesting to hear his relationship with his local parish as a priest, but I find it interesting he has many of these philosopher friends, and it's a difference from today where I could be wrong, but it seems like most, especially Christian leaders, tend to reject philosophy as a kind of a hindrance to faith. This is stemming from the Protestant Reformation with Martin Luther and sola fide, Latin for faith alone. Martin Luther was quoted saying, rationality is a whore. Thinking philosophically, logically, gets in the way of your spirituality. That's kind of been the Protestant Enlightenment spirit, and you can see how from the 1500s, when the Protestant Reformation started, till now, about 500 years, we can see the effect of the rejection of rationality because of Luther's proposition, and many people agreeing. Now, I would argue people agree with Martin Luther not because he's right, but because people are lazy. People don't want to examine their own axioms, their own beliefs. Therefore, it's more convenient to accept what has been given to you. In the West, Protestantism is more or less the most influential religion, especially in America. And I'm kind of speaking mostly from an American framework because I live in America. But also, if I didn't live in America, I do think I would still be focusing on America, because America more or less is the successor of the Roman Empire. The eagle in our White House, the eagle as a symbol for America was a symbol for the Romans. A lot of the structures in the judicial system we get here in America, we got from Rome. More specifically, America, a brother or a sister from the British Empire, and the British Empire forming under the Magna Carta, heavily influenced by Roman philosophy. I'm saying all this because I'm praying and working towards, whatever this means, resurrecting the spirit of philosophy. Because I'm reading Marsilio Ficino and I am reading the priests and the spiritual leaders of today, and I'm seeing a big difference. And the biggest difference is philosophy. Marsilio Ficino has a relationship with philosophy as someone has a relationship with their mother. And you just don't see that anymore. I'm going to continue. And he's saying how Mercury and Saturn under Aquarius is closely aligned with philosophy. And we've talked about Mercury and Saturn being very influential to the Roman religion pre-Christianity. Jupiter was the kind of top of the pantheon in the Roman religion, but Saturn, I would say, is the number 2. Remember, the Jews have the Sabbath. Some thinkers argue that the Jews not just revere Saturn, but get their laws, their beliefs, their practices from Saturn. In other words, the Jews worship Saturn. Semantically, you have the Sabbath sounding a lot like Saturn. You have the last day of the week, the last major planet, Saturn being the planet of law, work, time. These are principles in the Jewish tradition. Yes, there are fractions within the Jewish tradition, like there are fractions in Islam and in Christianity, but the Jews in particular have a foundational belief, and those foundational beliefs, I think, have a lot to do with time, have a lot to do with work, and have a lot to do with law. And we'll continue because this can bring us into a very deep hole. I think the deepest philosophical hole someone can go through is the study of the Jewish religion. And I'll just say because it's very similar to the Babylonian myths. The Jewish tradition is very similar to the Egyptian myths. The Jewish tradition is very similar to the Assyrian myths and the Chaldean myths and the Mithraean tradition. I'm not saying the Jewish tradition is right or wrong because it is similar to other religions. I'm just saying it's worth examining how similar and yet the distinctions between the Chaldeans and the Jewish tradition. You have similar myths like the flood myth in Noah to the Epic of Gilgamesh and Homer talking about a giant flood. My point is this: philosophy is a perennial study. Philosophy is an infinite perennial study. So what you learn in philosophy is true yesterday, it's true today, and it's going to be true tomorrow. Perennial. Which is why it's very important to study. Before we get on that tangent, I'm going to keep going because just mentioning Mercury and Saturn again makes me think of Rome, which is the West, and the Jews, and how Mercury can represent the god of Rome. And then you have Saturn, which can represent the god of the Jews. And then you have this dynamic of Mercury and Saturn and how this relates to philosophy. Now, I don't know why Marsilio Ficino mentioned Mercury and Saturn under Aquarius specifically contributes to philosophy, but if I were to guess, Aquarius, fluid, having to do with water and having to do with a new creation. When you're a baby, you're in a womb and you're in the water. We're kind of born into water. And we know baptism's extremely important. Here's where it gets interesting. Baptism, water, is important in the Christian tradition. Jesus Christ was born year 0, died in 33 AD. But Jesus was born in the age of Pisces, which the symbol is the fish. And as I'm reading more about the esoteric meaning of Pisces, as I mentioned before, here's what it says. At this stage, negative fluid and endowed with an instinctual consciousness which contains within itself the potentiality of the intuition. Okay, so it talks more about that, but you want to know the main point. Water, a new beginning, and Jesus Christ is tied to this. You have fish being a important symbol in the Christian tradition. And you also have, from the Pisces age, entering into the Aquarian age, which we are now in now. He's kind of ending this letter with talking about how his friend is remarkably moving towards the higher realms, as he says, towards the higher sun. And it's saying it makes him a successful way of the Platonists. And he says he's clarifying not under the moon but under the sun. These where a lot of the mysteries come from. He's saying farewell to his friend and hoping Apollo will be his guide and that he attains truth and glory. We're going to continue to letter 14 and we'll probably finish here. So we are about halfway done. We spent a lot of time just talking about Saturn and Mercury, and we can spend much more time. It was a brief introduction on the Jewish religion. Letter 14. Distinguishing marks of genuine Platonists and also on ideas. Now he's writing to Francisco di Getto, another Platonist. Wow, here Marsilio Ficino does something I've never seen before in philosophy. A lot of philosophers will put Plato against Aristotle as almost like they are rival teams. You have like a high school football team and you have the local rival of that high school football team. A lot of philosophers try to bring this narrative into the Platonic and Aristotelian teachings. Plato, very idealistic, he's very focused on metaphysics, while Aristotle is less interested in metaphysics and more interested in physics. Now, here's what Ficino does. He says, people are in error when they say Aristotle is in opposition to Plato. And he says this because it is through the natural world that leads us to the divine. This is profound because, again, people say Aristotle was a materialist. Aristotle thought Plato was too in his head. Plato is thinking too much in the eternal reality of the forms. And Plato is so focused on the forms that are in the heaven that Plato forgets to look down at the ground. And Aristotle is one who won't look up into the heavens, but would rather look down at the ground and examine physical matter. Now, again, Ficino is saying, when you study the physical matter, it will bring you to the divine. So it makes no sense to put Aristotle in opposition to Plato. Ficino just ended scientism and the Enlightenment period. This is what Ficino did in this one sentence. Natural world leads us to the divine. The reason Ficino ended the Enlightenment, scientific, materialist, atheist position is because you have someone like Francis Bacon saying, we will torture nature and she will reveal her secrets. So you have the study of nature, and through that study you will receive revelation that is divine. Now, I'm stuck here because while the scientists, the Enlightenment period, rejected religion more or less, I don't think Francis Bacon in that thought has any kind of relation to the divine or spirituality, which is a complete contradiction. Why would you torture nature for her to reveal her secrets when there is no divine principles like truth, goodness, and beauty? In the scientific materialist framework, there is no truth, there is no goodness or beauty, there is only science. No metaphysics. You can't have science, you cannot torture nature for her to reveal her secrets. You can't do that without a principle of truth, an underlining grounding of truth, which is metaphysical. Again, it's a contradiction to say nature and the divine are fighting, they're in contrary. Alchemy is the wedding of nature and the divine. This is where we get our modern study of chemistry, came from alchemy. This tradition of studying the natural world and having it reveal divine revelations. Again, he's saying people need to be initiated into Aristotelian teaching. And once you're deep into Aristotelian teaching, then you can understand Plato better. I've never read this before. This is quite interesting. Let's keep going. Well, now he's talking about how the first mind
or the Logos, or the first creation of God, that has a relationship to particular entities, and they're not completely separate. So, universalism, this idea of objective truth. Ficino's saying his friend acknowledges this, and that Ficino always has acknowledged this. Okay, and he's saying that this can kind of be explained in the Timaeus, Plato's dialogue, where you have younger gods or daemons. The daemons or the lower gods are the ones who communicate or are in relationship with individual creatures. And this is under the moon. While the architect, who I think Ficino's mentioning is the ultimate one, is the one who gives order. So you have little gods communicating and in relationship with humans, connecting with humans, and then you have the ultimate one who is unseen and is the grounding of order. Now he's saying it's not a vast multiplicity in what is absolutely united. And I'm extremely confused on what he's trying to say here. Hopefully one day I'll be able to understand this. He's saying this idea that individuals are changeable and they're not separate from other individuals, but they are different in intelligence. I guess that makes sense, but I need to think about this. I don't have any comments on this, but I'm excited for letter 15, which is an apology for a long silence. And it's actually a letter to the ambassador of the Pope, which should be very interesting. Thank you for tuning in. It was a different 2 letters from the ones before. Thank you for listening.